Hello, hello. Welcome back to No Me Callo. I won't stay quiet. I'm your host, Lomelin, and you already know, new month, new series. This month's series is called Choosing Myself Without Needing to Explain. And I want to make something clear from the beginning. This is not about becoming cold. It's not about shutting down. It's not about stopping communication. And it's not about distancing yourself from the world. It's not a defense. It's not an armor. It's about something much more deeper. It's about stopping the ways you betray yourself in the name of being understood. Because if we're honest, so much of life has been lived from that place, from the constant need to explain yourself, explaining what you feel, explaining what you decide, explaining what you stay silent about, explaining what shifts inside of you, even explaining why it's painful to name. And as if every emotion, every reaction, every boundary, every silence, every need had to go through external approval first in order to be allowed to exist without guilt. And that's where the real exhaustion begins. And everything you have to do, just so what you feel can be acceptable to someone else. So it doesn't make them uncomfortable, so it doesn't create conflict, so you don't get misunderstood, and so you don't get abandoned. So this first episode of the series opens exactly that. Is the internal space where all of this begins. The episode 1 is called Stopping the Need to Explain Myself in Order to Be Understood. Because think about it. How many times have you shrunk yourself just to be understood? How many times have you softened what you felt just to avoid discomfort? How many times have you added context after context just to make your truth more acceptable? And in this episode, we're going to go there, into how we learn to over-explain ourselves, into what part of us believes we need to do it, into what fear gets activated when we don't, and into what it feels like to slowly let that need go. Because there comes a point when you start to realize you don't need to be perfectly understood to be valid, and that over-explaining yourself doesn't always bring people closer. Sometimes it only takes you further away from yourself. So you know what to do. Get comfortable, grab your coffee, your cafecito, your glass of wine, or a cold beer, and get ready to chismear with me. But no one is born over-explaining themselves. No one is born doubting their truth. That is not something we come into the world with. It's something we learn. And we learn it in very subtle ways. So subtle that at first you don't even recognize them as wounds. You just live them. You just absorb them and you just repeat them. You learn it when as a child your emotions were too much for someone else. When you cried and were told it was enough. When you got angry and you were told that you were exaggerating. When you needed attention and you were told that it wasn't that serious. Your sadness became drama. Your anger became too much. Your needs became a lot. Your sensitivity became overreacting. Your silence became a problem. And without even realizing it, you start receiving a very clear message, even if no one said it directly. What you naturally are doesn't quite fit as it is. And that's where something inside of you begins to shift. Not suddenly, not visibly, but slowly, quietly, internally. And you start observing yourself. You start measuring yourself. You start adjusting yourself. You start thinking before you feel. You start feeling before you speak. You start speaking but editing yourself as you go. And that's where something very deep is born. Something that later becomes automatic. The need to explain yourself. Because without realizing it, you start to believe that your truth is not enough on its own. That if you don't explain it well, if you don't justify it, if you don't soften it, if you don't package it properly, it won't be accepted. And so you begin doing something that seems small, but completely changes the way you relate to yourself. You start translating yourself, translating what you feel so it doesn't make others uncomfortable, translating what you need so it doesn't sound intense, translating what you decide so it doesn't create conflict, translating who you are so it's easier for others to receive you. And without realizing it, you stop living from what you feel, and you start living from how you're going to justify it. It's no longer, this is what I'm going through. It becomes more of a, this is what I'm going through, but let me explain it so it makes sense to you. It's no longer, this is what I need, and it becomes, this is what I need, but let me clarify that it's not a big deal. It's no longer, this is who I am, and it becomes, this is who I am, but I hope you understand it. I hope it doesn't make you uncomfortable, and I hope it doesn't change how you see me. And here I want you to pause for a moment and ask yourself, when did I start to feel more important to be understood than to be honest with what you feel? because that is the root. It's not just about explaining, it's about learning to doubt yourself before anyone else even has the chance to. And when that becomes your normal, you don't even notice it. But you start living from anticipation of judgment, not from your truth, but from the reaction your truth might create. And that slowly drains something very deep, not just your voice, but your relationship with yourself. And this isn't always obvious. It doesn't always show up as something big or dramatic. It doesn't always feel like a breaking point. Sometimes it shows up in the small things, in what you say almost without thinking, because it has already become automatic. Sometimes it looks like this. No, I'm not mad. I'm just tired. Even though deep down there is anger, even though something did hurt you, but you learn that naming it directly may be too much for someone else. Maybe you say, I'll explain it so you don't misunderstand me, as if your truth needs constant protection, as if there's always a risk that what you feel won't be enough on its own. Or it's not you, it's just how I am, as if your way of being has come up with built-in apologies. Or I think you misunderstood me, even though part of you knows it's not that you were misunderstood, but that you weren't really heard from the place you were speaking from. And without even realizing it, you start living in this space where you're not just speaking, you're translating yourself while speaking. You're not just expressing, you're editing yourself in real time. You're not just communicating, you're monitoring yourself. Before you speak, you're already thinking about how it's going to sound. While you're speaking, you're already measuring how you're being received. After you speak, you replay every word, every tone, every silence, as if there was something you could have done better to make yourself fully understood. And the heaviest part is that it becomes invisible to you. You don't question it anymore. You just do it. You repeat it and you just live it. And there comes a point where even when you explain yourself well, even when you choose your words carefully, even when you try to be as clear as possible, you're still not always understood. You're not always received the way you intended. And you're not always seen the way you're showing up. But you're already exhausted. You've already given too many versions of yourself. You've already softened too much of what you feel. And you've already adjusted your truth too many times just to make it fit. And the most painful part isn't that you're not understood. It's that in the process of trying to be understood, you slowly drifted away from yourself. And here's something important. Over-explaining is also a form of self-abandonment. And it doesn't always feel like that at first. It doesn't feel like abandonment because you're still there. You're present, you're speaking, you're trying, you're doing the right thing. You're giving context, you're clarifying, you're carefully choosing your words so you don't hurt anyone, so you don't create conflict, so you don't lose anyone in the process. But if you look deeper, what you're actually doing is leaving yourself in order to hold a version of you that others can accept. And you abandon yourself every time you doubt what you feel the moment you feel it. Every time an emotion shows up and instead of trusting it, you question it. Every time you ask yourself if what you're feeling is valid before simply allowing yourself to feel it. You abandon yourself every time you believe your truth needs permission to exist. As if it has to pass through an external filter before it can be real. As if it's not enough that something hurts you, moves you, disrupts you, changes you. It also has to be approved, understood, justified. You abandon yourself every time you shrink so someone else doesn't feel uncomfortable with you. When you soften your tone, when you choose words that are less precise but more acceptable. When you hide that intensity of what you feel so you don't come across as too much, too complicated, too difficult to understand or hold. And the hardest part is that it doesn't feel like betrayal in the moment. It feels like maturity. It feels like communication. It feels like being a good person, being considerate of others. But underneath it, there's a kind of exhaustion you don't always know how to name. And it's a silent exhaustion. It doesn't make noise. It doesn't explode. It doesn't look obvious from the outside, but it builds up in every unnecessary explanation, and every time you justify yourself before being questioned, and every time you correct yourself before being heard. Because on the outside, it looks like you're being clear. It looks like you're being responsible with your words. It looks like you're making the effort to communicate well, to avoid misunderstandings, to be transparent. But on the inside, something is slowly dimming. Little by little, you're leaving yourself behind. You're drifting away from the version of you that simply feels without negotiating its feelings. You're moving away from that inner voice that doesn't need permission to exist. And the hardest part of realizing this is understanding that it wasn't one single moment. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was a habit, a survival strategy. a way to be accepted, a way to not lose important connections. But now, at this point, it's no longer just survival. It's a habit, it's identity, it's automatic. And maybe that's why it hurts more when you see it. Because you don't even know exactly when you started leaving yourself in order to explain yourself better to others. And there comes a moment where something shifts. Not in an explosive way, it's more like an internal exhaustion you can no longer ignore. Like something inside of you quietly says, enough, without noise, but with a clarity you can't unsee. And not because you stop feeling, because that doesn't shut off. And not because you become cold or detached, or because you stop caring or stop wanting connection. You still feel just as deeply, maybe even more. But you still notice everything. You still read people. You still care about your tone. You still measure the impact of your words. But something fundamental changes. And it's that you stop negotiating what you feel. And that changes everything. Because you no longer enter into conversations with your own emotions as if they need approval. You don't take them to trial before expressing them. You don't try to shrink them so they fit more comfortably in someone else's mouth. You start to see them for what they are without immediately translating them into something more acceptable. And in that space, you start noticing something that used to go unseen because you were too busy explaining yourself. You start to see the pattern. You start realizing that the more you explain, the less you respect yourself. And not because explaining is inherently wrong, but because so often what you're actually doing isn't communicating. It's asking to be understood. It's trying to convince someone of your internal experience as if it wasn't already enough on its own. And the more you justify, the more you doubt yourself, because every justification quietly opens the door to the question, is what I feel okay, or should I change it to make it more acceptable? And without noticing it, you start giving away your internal authority. You stop trusting your first readings of things. You need a second opinion, and then another, and then another. And the more you try to be understood, the more you abandon yourself, because you start moving away from your center to get closer to someone else's understanding. And you begin reorganizing yourself emotionally to be accepted. You start adjusting the intensity, the shape, the rhythm of who you are so someone else doesn't get lost with you, while you are slowly losing yourself. And when you see it like this, without distraction, without justifying it, without romanticizing it, something uncomfortable appears. Something you don't always want to accept because it changes the way you relate to everything. Then maybe it's not about explaining better. Then maybe it's not about finding the perfect words. Then maybe it's not about making it clearer, softer, easier to understand, but something much more direct and much more harder to hold. That the one who wants to understand you will, and the one who doesn't simply won't, no matter how much you explain, no matter how much you adjust, no matter how many times you repeat it from different angles, with different tones, with different versions of yourself. Because the real understanding doesn't come from perfect explanation. It comes from someone's willingness to see without asking you to shrink. And when that becomes clear, something inside of you can't stay the same anymore, because you stop chasing understanding at the expense of yourself, and you slowly begin to return to something more honest. Even if it feels uncomfortable at first, you come back to yourself. So this month is not about becoming harder. It's not about becoming distant. It's not about shutting down your feelings or closing your heart. This month is about something much more intimate, much more real, much more honest with yourself, coming back to you. Coming back to yourself is not a pretty concept. It's a process that can feel very uncomfortable, because it means looking at yourself without the layers you built to be accepted. It means beginning to notice how many times you drifted away from what you felt in order to explain it better to someone else, and still choosing to return. It means learning to trust what you feel, even when you can't fully explain it, even when it doesn't fit into easy words, even when someone else doesn't understand it right away. It's about stopping the habit of treating your emotions as something that constantly needs defense. It's about holding your decisions without translating them, without justifying every step, without anticipating questions no one has asked yet, without building a whole explanation around something you already know it's true for you internally. It's about speaking without rehearsing reactions, without running mental simulations of how your words will land, without editing yourself in advance to avoid discomfort that hasn't even happened yet. It's allowing yourself to exist in conversation without disappearing inside of it. And it's about choosing yourself without asking for emotional permission, without waiting for someone else to validate what already feels clear within you, without putting yourself on hold until everyone else feels comfortable with you. without placing yourself at the end of your own internal priority list. Because you don't need to be perfectly understood to be valid. You don't need every emotion to be fully digested for others. Because stopping over explaining in order to be understood is where we begin to see how often we've confused explaining ourselves with emotional survival. How many times we believe that if we don't explain ourselves well enough, then we won't be validated, understood, or accepted. And your truth doesn't need to be perfectly explained to be real, nor does it need to be perfectly understood to be valid. This is a process. You're going to notice you want to explain yourself again. You're going to want to soften. You're going to want to clarify, and you're going to want to convince. And this is where you do something new. You breathe and you pause. You don't need to fill the silence. You don't need to control interpretation. You don't need to close every possible door of misunderstanding. You just need to be honest with yourself. And as always, I want to recommend a book that it's called You Are a Badass by Jen Sincero. And it's a personal development book that invites you to stop living from doubt, fear, and the need for approval and start trusting yourself more deeply. The book talks about how we often limit ourselves through internal beliefs like, I'm not enough, or I have to explain myself to just be accepted, and how those beliefs make us overthink, overjustify, and abandon ourselves without realizing it. Throughout the book, the author pushes you to recognize your worth without depending on external validation, to let go of the habit of over-explaining, and to start making decisions from what you truly feel, not from what others expect from you. So this book is a reminder to stop asking for permission to be yourself and to start living with more confidence and alignment with who you are. So I highly recommend it. So this is the invitation to stop explaining yourself when you already know what you feel. To stop justifying decisions that are born from your truth. To stop shrinking yourself so others can feel comfortable. And to start living from a place where not everything needs to be translated. Because not everything you are has to be understood to be valid. Not everything you feel has to be approved to be real. And not everything you decide has to be explained to be respected. And even though for a long time you were taught otherwise, that if you don't explain it well enough, it doesn't count. That if it's not understandable, it doesn't matter. That if you don't justify it, then it's wrong. Here you are, breaking away from that, breaking away from the need to be perfectly understood in order to exist in peace with yourself. Because there comes a point in life where you no longer want to keep losing yourself just to be accepted. You no longer want to keep translating yourself until your voice no longer sounds like you. And you no longer want to keep softening yourself until you become unrecognizable to yourself. And that moment, that quiet moment where you decide not to explain yourself again, is the beginning of something very big. Not outside, but inside. The beginning of coming back to yourself, of trusting yourself without witnesses, of holding yourself without an audience, of choosing yourself even when no one is clapping. Because in the end, freedom doesn't look like having all the answers. Freedom looks like no longer needing to explain them all. So the next time you feel like the urge to explain yourself, pause for a second, breathe, and ask yourself, am I communicating or am I abandoning myself in order to be understood? Because that is the most important difference in your life. The difference between explaining yourself to survive or holding yourself to live. And in that difference begins your return to yourself. Your life doesn't need to be an argument. It doesn't need to be a defense. And it doesn't need to be a constant explanation. Your life needs to be lived from you, without translation, without permission, and without self-abandonment. Your life is not an argument. Your life is yours. In the description of this episode, you'll find the Amazon link with the full list of books mentioned in No Me Callo, I Won't Stay Quiet, from the very first episode to today's. And don't forget, every Friday there's a new episode waiting for you. And the next episode is one of the most important ones in the series, and it's called Saying No Without Guilt. Because for many people, saying no doesn't feel like a decision. It feels like a risk. It feels like letting someone down. It feels like being selfish. It feels like losing love. And it feels like causing discomfort. And without realizing it, you start associating no with guilt. As if setting a boundary means you're doing something wrong. As if choosing yourself automatically means disappointing someone else. So in the next episode, we're going to go exactly there, into that space where you say yes when you actually meant no, into that space where you over-explain a boundary that you shouldn't even need justification, into that space where you end up carrying anxiety after choosing yourself just because you were taught that boundaries come with a cost. And we're going to talk about something that can truly change the way you relate to yourself and others, that a complete no doesn't need a long story behind it. It doesn't need defense, and it doesn't need over justification. It only needs truth. Because saying no doesn't make you a bad person. You don't need to explain yourself or explain every boundary for it to be valid. And the guilt that shows up after setting a boundary doesn't always mean you did something wrong. Sometimes it just means you're breaking an old pattern. So in the next episode, I'm inviting you into something simple but powerful. Practicing a no with a necessary explanation. Holding discomfort without abandoning yourself. Staying with yourself even when someone else doesn't understand it right away. Because learning to say no without guilt doesn't make you harder. It makes you honest with yourself. So don't miss it. You were listening to No Me Callo, I Won't Stay Quiet. I'm your host, Jessica Lomelin. Until next time.